Before I introduce our guest today, I have a few remarks. Our director was over at my house last night, got a call on his cell phone, and someone named Sarah thought that I should say that people should go to the PTA to make sure the kids don't have to wear uniforms in school. And I said I would say that. So I would agree with that, but even if you don't, go to the PTA and tell them what you think. Other thing is that you may or may not be aware that some time ago I started a magazine called Outspoken, which is no longer being published by the people who took it over, and I'm going to do an online magazine for gays, lesbians, and straights. And so if you look at the end of the show, it will say ruralirony.com, and if you would like to input or to get a copy of that sent to you, by all means, email me or call me. I'm in the phone book. Now, our guest. One of the ladies here at the station met a man at the airport and thought he would make a great guest. And I met him and I agreed, and I'd like you to meet Mr. Elias Okach. Welcome, Elias.
Thank you very much.
Elias is from Kenya, which, when we got to talking, I had on the other side of it, on the wrong side of Africa, but I'm learning. Elias, as we talk, Africa is sort of split into different sorts of territories. You want to kind of give us a view of that? I mean, in the sense of there's, at the top, there's the Muslims, and then...
Yes, Africa as a whole continent is made up of different political groups. We have all these intergovernmental, political blocs, but the most one is we have the Organization of African Unity that brings all the countries in Africa, about 50 countries there now, and then we have what we call the Sub-Saharan Africa. You read a lot of stories, and reports in the news media where they talk about AIDS. Statistics is so much in Sub-Saharan Africa, and you always wonder what is the Sub-Saharan Africa and then what is the whole of Africa. Now, the concept of Sub-Saharan Africa simply means the Africa south of the Sahara as the Sahara Desert. And this is not just like a physical distinction, but it also has got connotations of race and religion, in that you find the Sahara Desert, the northern part of Africa where we have the desert, is mostly occupied by Arabic populations. So we have Algeria, we have Libya, Tunisia, and those are Arabized. They're the Arabized north. And then we have down low of the Sahara, we have now what we call the dark-skinned Africans, people who look like me and don't look like Hosni Mubarak of Egypt. And therefore, we also have, based on that, the north, also the Arabized north, tend to be Muslim. So because of that, you find they'll belong to, they're affiliated to the Arab League, which is brings the countries from the Middle East and the northern part of Africa, and sometimes mostly countries, they're affiliated to also countries that are overwhelmingly Islamic.
Well, Northern Africa has, of course, allegiance to the continent, but you're saying it has a political shift towards
the Middle East,
towards Iran, Iraq,
and sometimes a lot of relations and close ties with Islamic countries like Indonesia or Pakistan because of the religious ties.
Okay, now that we've got that taken care of, let's focus on Sub-Saharan Africa. We were talking about, I asked you whether you identified as an African or as a Kenyan, and you were telling me that some of these borders overlap. Would you like to talk about that?
Yes. The concept of Kenya as a nation, as a country, did not exist until 1963, when somebody in the British Foreign Office, tired of the Mau Mau War, which was the liberation movement that had fought with the British to liberate Kenya at that time. We didn't have a concept of Kenya, but it was just called the British East African Protectorate. The Ugandans had their side, and the Kenyans had their side. Decided that we're going to give them their freedom, but decided to call our section Kenyan. So we had these arbitrarily drawn borders, and Kenya was a construct of colonialism. Therefore, so I call myself a Kenyan. based on that, because it's the international norm. Countries have been drawn, and we have borders. But also we have ethnicity, which plays a big role in that. You find when these borders were drawn, some huge section of ethnic groups were left one side, and therefore I come from a Nilotic group called Luo, and you have Luos in Uganda, you have Luos in Tanzania, and Luos in Kenya. But before the coming of the Europeans, before the 19th century meeting in Berlin, in which the partitioning of Africa took place, and all the powers decided to fragment Africa, divide it among themselves and give them new names, we had three major groups in Africa: the Bantus, the Cushites, and the Nilotes. The Bantus came from the western part of Africa, where you have Nigeria today, and Senegal and Ivory Coast, and migrated into the central part of Africa, into the southern part of Africa.
Because of the Europeans?
No, that was way
just
before the Europeans, like way back in the 11th, 10th century. Okay. And this was just the typical migration which occurs normally when population, carrying capacity of an area becomes high, and conflicts, and in search of better pastures or agriculture. And the Bantus tend to be predominantly agricultural, Then we had the Nilotes, who came from the north. The reason why they're called the Nilotes is because they came down the River Nile.
Oh,
so the Nilotic tribes, the Nilote therefore is just an adjective, and therefore the Nilotic tribes came down, the Nilotes as a huge group came down River Nile from the north, from the Sudan. They can't track exactly where the journey began, but somewhere in the Sudan, down River Nile into Uganda, what present-day Kenya, and settled in those regions. You find the Nilotes in Sudan, in Uganda, and in Kenya, in Tanzania. And then we had the Cushites, who came from the east, northeast, where we have the Horn of Africa, we have Somalia. And this is where we have the Ethiopians. And you can tell the physical features are different. If you look at Ethiopians and Somalis, they have sharp, features, straight nose, straight hair, and then you find the Nilotes are very dark-skinned, people in southern Sudan and, people in Kenya like me. And the Bantus tend to be very, light-skinned, and they're overwhelmingly agricultural. So the South Africans, mostly all the Zulus and all the little tribes, those are mostly Bantus, and those are the main subgroups.
Well, what you're saying is that whereas we sort of tend to think in terms of countries distinct, that really these are kind of European overlays over a much more complicated situation.
Yes, I think Africa as a continent, is a country, is a region with high, like all kinds of ethnic, subgroups. It's very complex, and a lot of subgroups that one big ethnic group, and then they have subgroups, and then they have various groups again within those groups, and they existed like that before the coming of the Europeans. Now, with the new borders drawn and all these groups find themselves, lampooned together into one section called Kenya, one section called Uganda, they had no choice, but life has to go on now, whereby if I'm a Luo in Kenya, if I'm a Nilote in Kenya, I'll always try to, see myself as a Kenyan ahead of everything else, because this is just the way it is today.
You told me that English is your third language, and your first
is Luo.
Is Luo?
Uh-huh.
And
Swahili.
And Swahili is your second.
Yes, and then English I learned as a third language, yes.
Did you learn these all at once, or?
Well, I grew up, and the reason why we say mother tongue is because that was the first language that, we spoke, which is Luo. And then as you go to school, the mode of instruction in Kenyan schools is in English. So they teach you English, and you have to start learning English, the alphabet, A, B, C, D, saying what is your name. And then at the same time, Swahili is taught in school, but they don't put a lot of emphasis on it as in English, because English is the mode of instruction. But Swahili is more or less the language that developed in the 15th century, if I might give you a little background. And it developed along the coastal line of, Pemba, Zanzibar, and Mombasa. Those are coastal towns along the Kenyan and Tanzanian coast.
Well, that's a language we've heard, or at least I have. Swahili rings a bell, Luo doesn't.
Yeah, but because Swahili is widely spoken in several areas in Africa, and Swahili developed as a mercantile language. When the Arabs came to bring in, they brought several things. They took ivory and slaves, and they brought in, silk and spices, and they settled along the coastal line. They also brought Islam as a religion, but they intermarried with the Bantus who settled along the coastal line, the Mijikenda, which was the overwhelming subgroup of the Bantus. And then through the Bantu spoke their Bantu, and the Arabs spoke their Arabic, and they married, the two languages were married, and Swahili emerged. So when they came in interior to trade, they had to find a language they could use to speak to the people in interior. And therefore, the translators started speaking Swahili, which was a mixture of Bantu, but also a mixture of Arab, so that when Saddam Hussein is on TV calling, President Bush or President Clinton Satan in the White House, I understand that in Arabic, because Ibilisi is the Arabic word for Satan, and it's the same word in Swahili. In Kenya, we say, Ibilisi means just an evil person. So there's that closeness between Arabic and Swahili.
So that doesn't have Satan has Christian connotations for us.
No, I'm just giving you an example. Yeah, but as I'm saying, because Swahili and the closeness between Swahili and Arabic, and that's I'm saying, when I listen to somebody speak Arabic, I understand part of it because there's a lot of Arabic words in Swahili, and there's a lot of Bantu words. And so Swahili developed as a mercantile language that has since spread, not only in Kenya, but has spread from Tanzania to Uganda to Central Africa, and is being promoted more now like the African language, because Africa as a continent does not have a common language that transcends all these ethnic, groups other than English.
No idea.
Yeah.
Sort of like Pidgin English in Asia and those islands that
yes, yeah,
developed as not quite English, and it's
yes, but you can find that Swahili is uniquely different. It's at the same time has got African roots, but it also has got the historical carryover of the Arab influence along the coastal line, and it's therefore widely spoken now. And you grew up learning that, and in Kenya, it was promoted as the national language because when we got independent, we had to overcome the ethnic rivalry that used to exist. You realize these tribes used to fight with each other. They used to go to war. But now if they're all put together and are told, you're Kenyans, you have to coexist and form a nation and develop it, how do you make these people like each other when they're going to be speaking, one person is speaking English, one person, so Swahili was promoted as the only national language that is used during holidays, during special festivities, to bring the people together and break down those ethnic barriers. So I grew up learning Swahili in the playground with kids from another tribe who could not speak my language, and I could speak their language, and therefore that's how Swahili mostly spreads in Kenya. It's also taught in school at a higher level. They have literature in Swahili, but most is a language you grew up learning just in the hood, as they might say here.
And English then becomes the governmental language,
the official language, the one that is in documents. When you apply for passport, you fill it in English, the form. Although now they have the Swahili part of it, but it was more of the bureaucratic language.
Is it thought of as, for lack of a better term, upwardly mobile? I mean, if you have aspirations to higher education or to go out of the country? Or
you have to understand and speak English. Definitely. It's more of like somebody who speaks English. Definitely is more elitist compared to somebody who can only speak Swahili, because to learn English to a point that you can speak it well, you most likely won't pick it on the streets. You'll have to invest sometimes in school, in college, and therefore with it comes the elitism. But you find it's widely spoken because it's also the mode of instruction in schools, and newscast is in English and in Swahili. So
I'd like to follow Elias on this idea of the overlapping of borders in the country. You were telling me about Kenya's fairly politically stable, and therefore that means if there's instability nearby,
refugees.
What happens?
Yes, we've had problems. One of the things, each time you turn on TV and you watch a news story out of Africa, you can always bet that 9 times out of 10 it's going to be a story about civil war or stuff, and therefore we have a large number of political instability in Africa because of civil wars, and these have plagued Eastern Africa several times. That I would say in Kenya, almost all our neighbors have at one time or the other gone to war among themselves. Uganda next door started with a guy called Idi Amin Dada. That's the guy most people remember here, way back in the 70s, I think, before I was born. And then in Sudan, they've got a war that has been going on between the Arabized north and the animist south, in the Islamic north, trying to impose Sharia law on the southern animists and Christians. And therefore, there's this war where the south wants to secede and have their own autonomy and practice whatever religion they want. So that has been going on since, I think, about 16 years ago. And then in the north, we have Ethiopia that had got their own problem. We have the Oromo Liberation down there, who were trying to overthrow the government in Mogadishu, and in Addis Ababa. And in Somalia, of course, every American remembers what happened in Somalia. That's a country that has been reduced to an anarchy, during the ouster of Siad Barre, and then what followed was, a governmentless nation, where warlords took over. And that has been going on up to now. Still, there's no central government in Somalia. Then we had the Rwanda and Rwanda problem with the Tutsis. But even before the slaughter of the Tutsis by the majority Hutus, there had been a war going on between the rebels and the government, and Burundi the same. Tanzania to the south is the only country that had never had political instability. And therefore, when all these wars take place, Kenya seemingly seemed to be therefore the only island of peace in this sea of turbulence. And as a requirement of the United Nations Charter, when refugees come into your country because they're fleeing war or persecution, you have to let them in. And therefore, at one point or the other, there's always 1 million refugees living in Kenya.
Who decided that, Elias?
I don't know. It's one of
We could, I mean, in a similar situation, if the Mexicans had a civil war, Americans
You
would
can't
have to
shut down your borders.
We would just have to
Yeah,
welcome
that's an
in.
international
So
requirement.
Kenya's
We have
borders are
open to refugees.
fairly transparent to
And they're protected by the
refugees.
international, that law. So that has been one of the issues where we've had we've hosted several refugees in Kenya, millions of them at some point. And when peace returns into this country, a lot of them go back. But the problem is these are internecine wars that one day they're gone, tomorrow they start again, and you just can't tell.
It also means, doesn't it, that Kenya has the infrastructure to handle aid? I mean, money comes into Kenya from the Red Cross and all of these.
Yeah, for a long time since we've never had the misfortune of experiencing a civil war, which normally, and its attendant, disruption of, this infrastructure and, the ordinary pace of government and order of business. We have enjoyed relative development in terms of, well-developed and expanded infrastructure as compared to, say, Uganda or Somalia, because you can tell when there's a civil war going on, highways get bombed out and buildings and telephone systems collapse. And therefore, Kenya has also played a role whereby we've been the center for humanitarian operations, because given the war going on in all these areas, for the United Nations or for CARE or for World Vision to operate and distribute food, they'll have to order them land them in a country where airports operate. But I must also add and honestly say that we have better infrastructures compared to this country, but we need to do something about it. I must have to say that as a Kenyan, we probably have rested on our laurels for so long that we've just taken it for granted that, we are the best around here. And now we have new countries that are getting stable and are investing more into this infrastructure, taking over, like Uganda next door is really doing well and have got well-developed telecommunication. Yes, but for a long time, and up to this point still, Kenya is the center for a lot of humanitarian operations, based on the fact that we are peaceful, relatively, and also we have a better infrastructure to handle such operations.
Ed said, ask him why everybody goes to Kenya. And I did. And one was, we talked about the political stability, or relative stability, but it's also, Kenya is a beautiful country.
Yes, one thing that is known, if you remember the movie that was made, Karen Blixen's movie, Out of Africa, it was shot in Kenya. It was a story about Kenya written by this British lady who lived in Kenya. We have some of the best wildlife in Africa. I mean, other than South Africa, which for a long time was, was a pariah nation because of their apartheid policy, and therefore nobody therefore could, a lot of countries had issued, a ban on travel to South Africa, and a lot of hotels could not do business with them. Kenya has got the most beautiful wildlife. We have the big five, the big game, that is the rhinoceros, the elephant, the lion, the big cats and the hippos. And we also have a wide variety of, antelopes, the gazelles, and just a lot more to see, the bird sanctuary. So it's a paradise, and that's what makes tourists keep coming over and over again. And also, the Kenyan people are very hospitable, If you travel to Kenya, you find everybody who's gone to Kenya. Sometimes if you travel into the city, somebody will get their purse snatched in a city, and that is, all cities are the same. New York, Nairobi is just like New York. There's a bunch of guys who are just up to no good, like they would be in San Francisco. And they've been there for a few people who've come back and say, hey, I lost my purse in Kenya, I'm not going back. But that is just, that's not the norm, it's just the exception. So that is the beauty that is known a lot about Kenyans, and it's long distance runners that makes everybody ask me if I run.
I didn't know about long distance running.
Yeah, that's one thing that a lot of people know, Kenyans during the Olympics, or the Boston Marathon has been won by Kenyans the past 10 years in a row. So that's what makes people come to Kenya. It's the beauty, the wildlife and the scenery and the hospitality of the people.
I want to ask you, what is it like for you to come to grow up and be raised in a culture where black skin is the norm, and then come to some place like Missoula, where you can go weeks without seeing a black person? That must be a bit of a shock.
Yes, to a point, it was when I got here. Definitely, I knew that would be, I would have to live with that. Back in Kenya, I'd been exposed to a lot of expatriates, a lot of white folks who live and work in Kenya. I did some part-time work for the UN, and that's a place where, as the name suggests, it's the United Nations. You meet people there from all shades of, color and language and, backgrounds. But I knew that coming to Montana, definitely there would be, almost everybody would be looking white. And sometimes I can remember when I first got here, I went about a month without seeing anybody who was black. And one day in Billings, I was driving down the road and I saw these two black guys driving in front of me. And I followed them and chased them down and pulled them over more or less the way a police officer pulls over with headlights. And they got out and they were wondering, what do you want with us? What's your problem? And I said, I just wanted to say hello, because I've never seen a black man before I've been here for a month and I've never seen anybody black. And when I saw you guys, I just wanted to say hello. And they just burst out and laughed at me. They laughed and they said, that's so interesting, man. Well, you're from Africa. We might understand, we really do understand that it must be so strange for you. So it was, in a way that when you see somebody who is dark-skinned, you tend to look at them twice. You tend to wonder what they do and what their business here is. Whereas I took that for granted most of the time, living in Nairobi. I didn't know what it felt like for most of the white expatriates that I see in Africa.
I should have covered this in the introduction. You are going to university in journalism.
Yes, I'm majoring in journalism.
But you already are a journalist.
Yes, yeah.
You've done work. Would you care to talk about what you've done?
After my high school, I didn't get a chance to go to the universities in Kenya because the Kenyan government mostly supports information technology. So a lot of the people who get a chance to get government money to go to college, you have to be majoring in agriculture, physics, or one of those things, because they figure out that's the way to spur industrial takeoff. So I wasn't able to go and do my liberal arts with the government money, and I didn't have the money, so I didn't go to college. But when I was in high school, I started writing. I used to write for a student section in one of the largest newspapers there. And then I applied for the in-house training, which normally they would do, and run a training for about 6 months on how to represent the newspaper. So after 6 months training by this newspaper, I've got posted out in a small town as a correspondent. That is a stringer type of. And I did that for about 4 years for this newspaper, covered just about everything: the municipal market, the municipality, the fish market, the tournaments between high schools and the small technical college there, and then moved into a bigger city now where we covered the court systems there,
I'm sorry, the what kind?
The justice system, the courts, you know.
Court system.
Yeah, and then I did that for 4 years. So in 1996, I resigned. I wanted to pursue further education and get a real degree in journalism. And then we had a tragedy. My dad passed away before I could put together my trip to the U.S. And so I ran out of money. Funerals cost a lot of money in Africa. I mean, a funeral in Africa is a celebration in a way. So you have to throw big parties and slaughter a huge bull and people make merry. It's strange, but so it became so expensive that after that, I couldn't afford to come to school. So between 97 up to 99, I worked as a freelance journalist. I worked for the international media. I did everything from research to translation to reporting for various news organizations, the Los Angeles Times. At one point, I remember going on a story about a dying lake, Lake Victoria, invaded with a certain type of water hyacinth, you know, for the Christian Science Monitor, for Bridge News. So, I worked as a foreign, you know, I worked for the Association of Foreign Correspondents. That means everything I wrote had to be consumed overseas. You know, that's the thing. You can't be a local journalist and an international journalist. So I did that for about 2 years. And then I also worked for the United Nations as a part-time employee as an information officer. We would gather information on the operations of, you know, the United Nations in humanitarian issues and rewrite them.
You tell me you've written for the Billings Gazette and you speak down there. How is it that you're going to school here and you're so involved in Billings?
Well, that is part of how I got here. When I got here, I didn't have a lot of money. So I went to the United States Embassy in Nairobi and I said, I want to go to school in America. And they said, look, we have something called USIS, United States Information Agency. And they've got information on anything you want to know about the United States. So there's education department that told me, just say what you want to study, feed it into the computer. How, you know, if you want to study journalism, then the schools that offer journalism will come. Okay, with the cost, you can do a search with all these criteria. Mm-hmm. I didn't have money, so I looked for a 2-year associate degree in journalism. That's what I was trying to get, or, you know, TV, anything that had to do with mass media. And this school called May Technical College came up. It was really cheap, and it, you know, I wrote to the school and they sent me a catalog, and it looked fine. It was a starting point, and I could afford it. But it was in Montana, and I didn't care. I was like, it looked really fine. You know, the way they always present the brochures. So I ended up in Billings to go to May Technical College. Unfortunately, it was a smaller college, and it went bankrupt, I think, after being there for barely a year.
You're not talking, I thought you were talking about what we used to call Eastern, which is now Montana.
No. This small college where I came to, yeah.
A little
small
that
college.
I've never even heard of.
Yes.
Billings. Okay.
But when it went bankrupt, that's when I joined Eastern, Montana State University Billings. So it's in living while I was, you know, going to school there that I would write opinion pieces, commentaries. Even right now I spoke with a new opinion page editor, and I'm going to write an article on the bombing of the U.S. embassies because the trial is going now. And we talked about just recapturing what happened that day. I covered the whole thing for the LA Times. And so I've written, in my capacity, I've written mostly as an outsider who does commentary on issues that affect, you know, mostly international relations with a bias towards Africa, AIDS, Cold War, and how it affected Africa, and things like that.
That's a good place for me to segue a way back is to, it seems to me Africa is a place where so much is coming together and clashing. You mentioned the Cold War. For a long time when I was growing up, Africa was the center of these incredible, I remember when Egypt decided that it was going to turn down American aid and go with Russia, and dams were built and money was given,
and dictators were made.
And dictators were made, yes, and by the Americans. Would you care to address some of those?
Yes, I think that the Cold War affected the third world countries more than it affected the first world countries. Actually, the people who were at war, the people who owned the ideology that everybody was fighting over, you know. I know probably, yeah, Americans were killed at one point or the other. The Russians were killed at one, you know, the Soviet Union were killed at one point or the other. But the real war was exported to the third world countries. And Africa bore the brunt of most of these wars and their disruptive nature. It started immediately after the Second World War. Definitely that's when the Cold War started. And then, you know, the formation of the United Nations. And the United Nations came with new issues of human rights and the issues of freedom and liberty came in. And therefore, the end of the Cold War and the formation of the United Nations started this movement of nationalism in third world countries. And therefore, African countries and several other third world, you know, countries that were colonized by European powers gained independence. But at this same time, this is when the Cold War picked up and competition for sphere of influence was at its highest. So African countries gaining independence became the most attractive prizes for both the Soviet Union and the United States. And therefore, the rush to you know, get as many alliances in Africa by both sides, by both of the superpowers, became an obsession in which each side would entice an African nation that just gets independence and say, look, we are the right guys to go with. We'll give you aid. We'll construct airports, hospitals, everything. And then the other side would come in and, you know, or get maybe an opposing party or politician on the side and say, look, these guys are no good. And before long, this translated into export of arms into Africa. And then the Civil War, with one side being backed by the United States, one side being backed by Russia. And these wars went on, and some of them are still going on, even though the Cold War is over. We still have a war going on in Angola, you know, UNITA down there with Savimbi trying to overthrow the government in Luanda. Was started that's part of is a vestige, is a relic of the Cold War. But even though the Cold War is over, those wars are still going on. The war is in Ethiopia. The wars in so many parts of Africa, in Mozambique. Those were all Cold War. You know, Congo, definitely, where we had the worst dictator Mobutu Sese Seko, who ruled the country for 35 years until he died in 1997 and was ousted, was made by the Americans. Immediately after Congo became independent from the Belgians, Patrick Lumumba, who was the first prime minister there, was seen by the Americans as leaning, he was being charming with the Soviets. And Congo is the largest country in Africa, the size of Western Europe, with the largest deposits, you know, mineral wealth in diamond and uranium. And therefore, the US just couldn't afford to have it fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. So it's, according to reports that have been made available now, it's known that the CIA actually played a role in the elimination of Patrice Lumumba, and Mobutu Sese Seko was put there. And he had since ruled the country for 35 years with an iron fist. Each time he was having trouble, he would get backing from France and the United States. And he just basically lorded it over his people, you know, reign over corruption, didn't develop infrastructure. But the whole time, it was also a very useful tool for the West in putting away communism. You know, he was a bulwark against communism. And so this is just one example. Mobutu is just one example, but we had several Mobutus, even in my own country. During the Cold War, the word human rights was interpreted differently in the United States than it is interpreted now after the Cold War. Kenya became independent, and then after that, we were like big-time supporters of capitalism in the United States. But then our leaders realized that they could get away with a lot. You know, they could get financial aid from the West without questioning, you know, issues of accountability and fairness in dealing with the people in terms of human rights. And therefore, human rights was violated over and over again by these governments. But nobody in the West who was supporting them came around and said, look,
well, why should we?
You know, because they served the purpose, definitely. And what you also didn't want them, you didn't want to upset them, because upsetting an African president would simply mean he would switch sides and go. So you are, in a sense, protecting your interests, and therefore, for a long time, the whole time the Cold War was going on, Africa was held at a ransom by this ideological war whereby human rights was pushed to the background. Issues of accountability and corruption were pushed to the background. Governments that had no right to be in existence were propped by either the Soviet Union or the United States. And this, for about 45 years or 50 years, Africa was stagnated with the wars. You know, if it was not a war, then it was corruption. like really debilitating corruption or abuses of human rights. And that's how the Cold War depraved Africa and has really led to a great extent to what we see today, the poverty, the instability, the low level of education. So I'm not blaming the Cold War per se, but that is somebody who wants to study the problem in Africa has to take into account the effect of Cold War in Africa and other third world countries too.
You speak of it as if it were all about politics and ideology, but there was a lot of natural resources, which you alluded to, that were at stake. It was going to control the diamonds, the uranium.
Definitely. That was to a large extent, definitely, it was also the economic interest. It was a matter of getting, because as I said, Congo, for example, had to be safeguarded. The Americans had to make sure that they were the people who had, the influence and therefore the concessions to do the mining and the exploitation of all these, resources. Oil in Nigeria, definitely, they had to make sure that, these are countries that have got oil and they have to keep them on their side so that, they can most of the time rely on them. If the Arab countries go on strike, they can always have countries in Africa that would still sell oil. So yes, there was the economic interest part of it, other than the ideology. A lot of the times, most Africans didn't care about the ideology.
And who ran the technology for the oil and the uranium?
Oh, also the West, definitely. I mean, it's BP Shell, or as the Nigerian environmentalist groups call it, BP Hell, because of the damage that it's caused in the Ogoniland in Nigeria. But yeah, definitely it was Western giant corporations, the multinationals that preside over the mining and exploitation of these natural resources. So definitely it created wealth, jobs, and for the Western nations, or to the Eastern Bloc also, because there were countries that were aligned to the East, and therefore the Soviet Union presided over the same thing that the West did with the allies in Africa.
So you have a whole class, don't you have technocrats who are non-African, by and large, who move from country to country depending on what the resources are? And
yeah, we have that. I mean, mostly in countries that have got oil. We know, for example, in Nigeria, the biggest, oil giants operate there, and they've got influence. They influence elections. I can't prove this, but that even in this country, that
they
interest groups.
Our elections. Yeah.
Yes, they do that back there. That they would always make sure that politicians who tend to be favorable to their operations there, and for example, don't buy into the criticisms of environmental groups, get more backing and support, and that sometimes they even supply mercenaries to make sure that these politicians safeguard their power and their regimes in case they're under attack from rebel groups. Mobutu in Congo was most of the time supported by South African mercenaries. A lot of the times, France would hire, and even the U.S. would send in Cuban, refugees here to go and help Mobutu.
I remember the Cubans were in,
sent to Africa. So yes, you have all these, they call them soldiers of fortune, that move from one country to another. And that has changed a little with the end of the Cold War, but still that left a mark on the continent, and the effects and repercussions are being felt till, up to this day.
I had never thought about this, and I had a Cuban on here, and we did a show on Cuba. I never realized the extent to which Cuba really is just a leftover of the Cold War. I mean, it's one of those loose ends that really is yet to be tightened up, and probably won't be until Castro does. Let's go on to religion a bit, because you say you're Catholic.
Yes.
And a kind of rebel Catholic, and yet your father dies.
Don't let
and
my
we
mother
slaughtered
hear
bulls.
that. If my mother hears,
Yes, well,
saying on TV.
I doubt that your mother is going to.
Yes, but I was born and raised Catholic, and Africa is overwhelmingly, Kenya is overwhelmingly Christian. Of course, there was no Christianity in Kenya before the arrival of Captain Frederick Lugard and all the rest of people who came with the CMS. I think that was the Christian Missionary Society of England that came, and then we had the White Fathers who came from Italy, and several other missionaries who came to evangelize Africa and show us the way to true God, even though at that time Africans had their own gods and believed in gods, and had their own organized religion, But over time, I think that their God overpowered our God, and then therefore the the African religions, most of them died, and a lot of people embraced the Christianity. And therefore, you find in most countries, other than some countries in, say, in the northern part of Africa, where, you know, they're overwhelming Islamic, African nations tend to be Christians. You know, Kenya is about 75%, 80% Christians. We have 10% Muslims along the coastal shoreline, where the Arabs, as I mentioned earlier, settled and brought, you know, Islamic with them.
I want to go back to this, though, that it's not a Christianity that we might recognize, let's say.
It's a Christian. We have people back in Kenya. I grew up in a very, very Catholic family where, you know, we had to wake up at 5 a.m. to say the rosary, you know, and say the prayers, and you know, like very Catholic, more Catholic than the Pope. No, that's a joke.
No.
But we were very Catholic in a way that when most Kenyans get converted, they embraced Christianity 100%. Whereas there are also those who got converted, but took what they wanted out of the Christian faith and retained part of their African religions.
That's what I
you know.
was trying to get at.
Yes,
yeah.
whereby they still, you know, do offerings. They still observe some cultural practices which are religious in nature. You know, like during the harvesting season, you know, they would give offerings and special prayers to their ancestors. You know, if a child is born, I've seen this back in the village where I come from, and he cries a lot. And after 8 days, they have to give the child a name. They would call the child with the names of the departed forefathers. They would call him so-and-so, 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 and he just continues to cry. And then they say one name, and the kid keeps quiet. And they say, oh, that was the grandparent crying in the child. It wasn't the child crying. It was the grandparent dying to be named so that his name can be carried over. And if you look at people who were Christians, and of course in my family we never did that. I told you I came from my mother considered that heathen. And but I've seen so many of my uncles who were at the same time Catholics or, you know, Anglicans do that. They would observe things like that. They would name the child a grandfather, a departed soul, whom they believe was there and existed. And if the child is sick, they would, you know, ask the departed soul of the grandparent father whom this child is named after, to intercede. And sometimes they don't take the child with us. They just say that, you know, you will be protected by your dead grandfather. So if you look into that, you must say that is practicing African religion besides Christian religion. And therefore, I would say that African religions are not gone per se. They still have some subtle practices that they carry on besides the organized Western religion.
Elias, in Europe, various countries have tried to bring back identities. The Welsh tried to, or have fairly successfully brought Welsh back. Gaelic was almost dead. It's been revived as a language to try to create an identity that is non-British. We talked about that. There was that kind of movement in Africa.
Yes.
And what happened?
What happened is immediately after most African countries became independent, definitely the independent movement itself was very nationalist. You know, it was started by people who had embraced the consciousness of being proud of who they are and saying, look, we have to rule ourselves. We don't want to have someone lord it. We don't want to have other people impose their power over us. So you can tell that the nationalist movement was born out of the pride for who these people are. You know, of what their language was, what their culture was. And it was more of the assertion of the African in them and saying, we're just as good as you are and we want you to go home and let us rule ourselves. So immediately after independence, I think that nationalism euphoria was very strong, that they started a movement called Africanization. In Kenya, for example, Africanization simply meant renaming the streets. We were talking in the car and saying that we still have names that most of them change, but still the Nairobi City Council can send you a water bill that has not been changed. They've never changed the system, and you find that you live in Mackinnon Road, or you live in Glasgow Lane, or you could be living in William Wilberforce Road, and you realize, what is that? I live in Kimathi Street. Why does my water bill say that I live in William, but it's
I
just that
mean,
those are the old names that Africanization process started changing the names of the streets to not reflect, I would say, European ideal, not to be Eurocentric, but they gave them very Afrocentric names, like call them Nkrumah Road in Nairobi. We have, Haile Selassie Avenue. These are all people,
Yeah.
that were like heroes of nationalism. And then this extended to trying to revive the teaching of African languages in schools. So when I went to school, we used to study mother tongue. Like I was taught Luo. I knew it because I spoke it at home, but at school, it was still taught to me to make sure that I spoke my mother tongue. We had the dances, cultural weeks was introduced. The drama, which used to be meant reciting poems from England, was changed more to like doing tongue twisters in mother tongues, and doing the African traditional dances. And this was a way of, I would say like reclaiming the culture and the traditions that were eroded during colonial days. And therefore, but this died off a little because, as I said, there was economic aspect to it. Most of these countries still depended on their former colonial powers for loans to develop the infrastructure, to build the economy, to create employment and schools. And therefore, they had to tone down their anti-Western rhetoric. It was not really anti-Western, but they had to look like, hey, we can still be friends, even though, we rule ourselves. But that kind of died down slowly. And we had, as Chinua Achebe said, that, colonization was brought through the front door. And it went out through the front door, but it was sneaked back through the back door. Because we have now what they call neo-colonization, where still the IMF and the World Bank and all these Western institutions have a lot of control over African countries, and therefore the embracing of the Western ideals was immediately after independence was not seen as very, very African. But all of a sudden, that died down because we still have to deal with the West in their own terms because of economic disparity that exists between us and them,
Elias, I was going to ask a question about Haile Selassie and Rastafarians, but I'm going to leave that. It's getting late. I want to ask you, and before I do that, let's say that Elias talks a lot about AIDS, writes about AIDS, and God knows I've done enough shows about AIDS, so I asked him if we could do a show just about Africa, and he would come back and we would discuss AIDS in Africa at another time. So I'm going to ask you kind of two parts, predicting the future of sub-Saharan Africa. What do you think it will be, and what would you optimistically like to see it be?
That's hard.
I should have warned you. I was going to ask that, I suppose.
I remember yesterday reading on the web a Kenyan newspaper. One of the Kenyan daily newspapers called the East African Standard, and it reported the same question was asked by a journalist in Nairobi at the airport to Wole Soyinka, the Nobel literature laureate, a Nigerian writer who I think is teaching at Harvard, and he's a prolific writer. Not only that, but he's also campaigned for the human rights and development in Africa, and most of the time he's always at odds with the governments in Africa for criticizing them. And therefore he's so passionately involved in trying to make Africa and sub-Saharan Africa emerge, get away from the doldrums of poverty and disease and civil war, and develop with the rest of the world. And he was asked the same question you asked me, and he was lost for words, but he's like this big-time academic that I'm not. But I think the same thing that a lot of people feel, and Mr. Soyinka said the same thing yesterday, is that the leadership first has to change. The leadership does not only have to change, they've changed most of the time, either by the gun or by the ballot. But the leadership, we have to have a leadership in Africa that really wants and is committed to change, is committed to bringing about economic development. And that would start by getting rid of corruption. That's number one problem plaguing economic development in Africa. And then we'd also have to have Africans themselves want to make something out of their own nations. And that is in the sense of taking, for example, steps to say no to regimes that are running down the economy. I know that can be hard sometimes when the regime is surrounded by all the latest high-tech gear in police riot control. But sometimes the people have to say no, and therefore the Kenyans themselves have to have the civic education and know that electing a politician that that does not care, who is corrupt, or who does not say anything about how to end corruption, and would mean that going back into the cycle. So I think number one is going to do with the people themselves. The people themselves have to show that through voting, and have to go out there and vote. And then we also have to have leaders that are committed to bringing about economic development, ending corruption, and embracing things like human rights, and developing the resources that is there, and ending greed and tribalism, which is one of the biggest from where somebody comes to power, brings his cousin, and they run the show, and it's a family affair, and they steal all the money, and the rest of the country runs aground, you know. So it's got to do more. I think number one is the leadership. And then the people like me who's talking here today go back home one day and vote and talk to people and bring about change, you know. I think America is a great country, but it's because most of the time Americans sometimes put down their foot and say, no, you can't do this to their leaders. And that's what we need. We don't have to do it with a gun, but through civic processes, you know. And that, to me, if you ask me, is the biggest thing, that the change must come from within us.
Elias, it's been wonderful meeting you and getting a different perspective, and I'm looking forward to having you back, talking about AIDS and other issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to your show.
Okay.
Appreciate it.